Chapter 1: The Christmas I Realized I Was Invisible. I never planned to destroy my boss's career. I planned to survive Christmas. But when he raised his glass, turned my years of work into a joke, and the room laughed, something shifted. Because what he didn't know was this: I was the one who kept every record, every approval, every decision they hoped no one would trace back. My name is Marianne, and this story didn't begin with revenge. It began with a Christmas toast that said more than he ever meant to say. I woke up before my alarm that morning, the kind of quiet December dawn where the house feels suspended between night and obligation. The coffee maker hummed softly while I stood at the counter scrolling through emails on my phone, already skimming subject lines about year-end numbers and final approvals. 14 years of habit had trained my eyes to look for problems before they arrived. My daughter was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, hair pulled into a loose knot, surrounded by half-printed forms. She was home from college for winter break, but her mind was clearly somewhere else. She told me she was finishing applications for summer internships and needed one more letter of recommendation. She said it casually, but I heard the weight under it. This mattered to her. She paused, then asked me something that made my hand still on the coffee mug. She asked how I knew when it was time to speak up at work. I smiled in the automatic way I had learned over years of meetings, and nodded as if the question were simple. I told her there was no single moment, that every situation was different. I said something about timing and professionalism. It sounded reasonable. It sounded empty. She looked at me for a second longer than usual, like she could tell I had dodged something. Then she went back to her screen. I kissed the top of her head, grabbed my coat, and told myself I would think about her question later. Downtown was already busy when I arrived at the office. Holiday decorations lined the lobby, tasteful and expensive in that corporate way. I had been at this firm long enough to remember when we rented 2 floors and shared a printer. Now we occupied 8 floors and hosted clients who flew in on private jets. I had joined the company in 2011, back when it was a small advisory group trying to look bigger than it was. I grew with it. I learned every system, every client pattern, every operational shortcut that kept the place running smoothly. Somewhere along the way, I became indispensable without becoming visible. That morning, I was finalizing the year-end operations report while also reviewing the draft of the CEO's speech for the holiday party. Fourth quarter numbers had shifted slightly after a late client adjustment, so I updated the figures and sent a note flagging the changes. I had done this hundreds of times before. An hour before the rehearsal, the CEO's assistant messaged me asking me to come to the conference room. When I walked in, the screen was already lit up with slides. The CEO stood at the front, remote in hand, chatting easily with 2 senior partners. As the slides advanced, something felt off. I scanned the leadership contributions page, the one that usually listed department heads responsible for execution. My name was gone. I waited, assuming it was a mistake. When the slide deck reached the end, I spoke up, keeping my tone neutral. I mentioned that the leadership slide looked different from the previous version. He glanced at the screen, then at me, and said it was cleaner this way. He said the focus should stay on vision, not logistics. Then he added, almost casually, that if any of the numbers were questioned later, I should be ready to explain them, since I was closest to the data. The room stayed quiet. No one objected. No one looked surprised. I nodded, because that was what I always did. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a private message from the head of human resources. She said the seating plan for the holiday party had been finalized and asked that I not sit at the main table. She said the CEO wanted clients and board guests there and hoped I would understand. I stared at the message longer than I should have. I understood perfectly. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of confirmations and last-minute approvals. People stopped by my desk to thank me for pulling everything together, to ask small questions, to tell me how excited they were for the party. I smiled and answered, the reliable center of gravity I had trained myself to be. At one point, I found myself alone in a conference room, gathering printed handouts. The space was quiet, chairs pushed back, the city visible through the glass walls. The CEO walked in, loosened his tie, and made a comment about how exhausting this season always was. He looked at me and said I was great at keeping things running. He said leadership required people who enjoyed the spotlight, people who thrived on being seen. He laughed lightly, like it was a shared understanding. I laughed too, because that was easier than saying anything else. After he left, I stayed there for a moment, holding the stack of papers against my chest. I thought about how many late nights I had spent fixing problems no one else wanted to touch. I thought about how often stability was praised in private and dismissed in public. I told myself I had chosen this. I told myself that consistency mattered more than recognition, especially when you were a single parent and benefits and predictability kept your life from tipping over. I told myself all the things I had been telling myself for years. But as I checked my calendar and saw the holiday party marked in bold that evening, something shifted. I thought about my daughter at the kitchen table, asking me how you knew when to speak up at work. I thought about what my silence had been teaching her all this time. I shut down the conference room lights, walked back to my desk and gathered my things. Outside, the sky was already dark, the city glowing with reflected lights. The party was in a few hours. I would attend, I would smile, I would do what I always did. But for the first time, I could not shake the feeling that this Christmas was about to show me exactly how invisible I had allowed myself to become.
Chapter 2. His Toast and the Room That Went Quiet. The hotel lobby was already glowing when I arrived that evening, all warm light and polished stone, the kind of place designed to make success feel effortless. A decorated tree stood near the entrance, ornaments reflecting the movement of people in tailored suits and cocktail dresses. I paused long enough to smooth my jacket and remind myself that this was still my workplace, even if it rarely felt like it belonged to me. Inside the ballroom, the noise swelled in waves. Laughter, clinking glasses, low music humming beneath conversations about travel plans and bonus rumors. I scanned the room out of habit, noting who was present, who had arrived with clients, who was already positioning themselves near the center. My name was on a table card halfway back, surrounded by department managers and project leads. Good people, hard workers. None of us sat at the front. The main table was closer to the stage, reserved for the executive team, board members, and key clients. I recognized several faces from video calls and site visits. They nodded politely when they saw me, the way people do when they are not sure how much attention to give. I took my seat and accepted a glass of wine from a passing server. The room felt festive, but there was a tension underneath it that I could not quite place. Maybe it was just the end-of-year fatigue. Maybe it was me. When Victor stepped onto the stage, the room quieted instinctively. He had a presence that filled space without effort. He smiled easily, lifted his glass, and waited until the last murmurs faded. He began by thanking everyone for another successful year. He talked about growth, resilience, adaptability. He praised the firm for navigating uncertainty and coming out stronger. Heads nodded around the room. People smiled. This was familiar territory. Then his tone shifted slightly. He said he wanted to share a story about what really made success possible behind the scenes. He spoke about dedication and long hours, about the people who made sure things ran smoothly so leaders could focus on the bigger picture. I felt a tightening in my chest, a small warning I had learned not to ignore. He said there were people who excelled at support, who were invaluable precisely because they did not seek the spotlight. He said leadership required a different kind of energy, the ability to move fast, to make bold decisions without being slowed down by process. The room chuckled softly. I stared at the stem of my glass. Then he said that some people were meant to support greatness, not become it. The laughter was louder this time, not cruel, not malicious, but unmistakable, the kind of laughter that signals understanding. I did not look up. I did not need to. I knew exactly where that sentence had landed. I felt heat rise in my face, then recede into something colder. My body stayed still, trained by years of meetings not to react. Around me, people shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else took a long sip of wine. When the applause came, I clapped along with everyone else, my hands moving automatically while my mind raced. I wondered if Victor realized how exposed he had just made me, or if that was the point. As the noise settled, the person seated beside me leaned slightly closer. He was a senior partner from a client firm, someone I had worked closely with on several complex projects. His voice was low, careful. He asked if that was how our company viewed senior leadership. I turned my head just enough to meet his eyes. For a second, I considered the safest answer, a deflection, a reassurance, but every option felt dishonest. The words stuck somewhere between my throat and my teeth. I told him that leadership meant different things to different people. It sounded vague even to my own ears. He nodded slowly, not convinced, and leaned back in his chair. I knew what he was thinking. I knew what he would remember. On stage, Victor raised his glass again, smiling broadly, clearly pleased with himself. The band began to play. Servers moved through the aisles. The party resumed as if nothing had happened. That was when I noticed Elaine. She sat at the main table, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She had not laughed, she had not clapped. She set her glass down with deliberate care and stood. A few people noticed and looked confused. She nodded to Victor briefly, then turned and walked toward the exit. As she passed my table, her eyes met mine. She did not smile. She did not stop. She simply inclined her head once and continued on. Something in my chest loosened just slightly. The rest of the evening unfolded around me in fragments. Conversations drifted in and out. People congratulated each other. Someone asked me about a project timeline. Someone else joked about year-end burnout. I answered, smiled, listened. I played my role. But underneath it all, my mind replayed Victor's words. Not just the sentence itself, but the confidence with which he had delivered it. The assumption that he could define my place publicly without consequence. I remembered the training modules we completed every year, the sections on respectful communication, on maintaining a professional environment, on avoiding public disparagement. I remembered clicking through them late at night, half distracted, never imagining they would apply to someone at his level. I finished my wine and switched to water. I watched the exits more than the stage. I noticed how some people avoided my eyes now, uncertain how to engage. I noticed how others offered extra warmth, as if to compensate. At one point, Rachel from Human Resources stopped by my table. She asked if I was enjoying the evening. Her smile was tight. I told her it was a beautiful venue. She nodded and moved on without meeting my eyes again. When the dessert plates were cleared and the music grew louder, I stood and made my way toward the back of the room. I did not feel angry. I felt something more unsettling. I felt defined. Victor had said the quiet part out loud. He had done it in front of clients, board members, and people whose opinions mattered. He had drawn a line and I was standing clearly on one side of it. As I stepped into the hallway outside the ballroom, the noise dulled behind me. The carpet muffled my footsteps. For a moment, I stood there, breathing in the cooler air, letting the reality settle. The laughter still echoed faintly from inside. Glasses still clinked. The party went on. But I knew, with a clarity that surprised me, that Victor had just said more than he intended. And once words like that left the room, they didn't disappear. They waited. I checked my phone, saw the time, and slid it back into my bag. Tomorrow would be another workday, another calendar full of meetings, another chance to pretend this was nothing. For now, I straightened my shoulders and walked back toward the noise, carrying the quiet certainty that this night would not end where Victor thought it would.
Chapter 3. What he thought I'd never put together. I did not leave the hotel right away. I waited until the noise softened, until the laughter behind me lost its edge and became background again. By the time I stepped into the cold air outside, the certainty I carried felt heavier, more defined. I drove back toward the office without fully deciding to do it, my body following a routine older than thought. The building was mostly dark when I arrived. Security nodded as I signed in, the familiar gesture almost comforting. I told myself I just needed my laptop, that it was easier than driving home and coming back in the morning.
That was true. It just was not the whole truth. The elevator ride up was silent. When the doors opened on my floor, the lights were dimmed, motion sensors asleep until I stepped forward. My heels echoed softly on the carpet as I walked toward my office. I was halfway down the hall when I noticed the glow near the pantry. Someone had left the lights on. I slowed without meaning to, instinct sharpening the way it always did when something felt off. Voices carried down the corridor, sharper than the low murmur of casual conversation. I recognized them immediately. Victor sounded irritated, his words clipped. Thomas Reed, our chief financial officer, answered with a strained calm that told me more than his actual tone. I stopped just short of the corner, not hidden, not eavesdropping through a door. They were standing in the open hallway, careless in the way powerful people often are when they assume the building belongs to them. Victor said they needed to move faster on the restructure in the first quarter of 2025. He said the board would not tolerate delays and that optics mattered after a year like this. Thomas replied that moving too fast would raise questions. He said there were too many historical threads, too many approvals that could not be rushed past scrutiny. Then he said my name. He said, "Marianne knows too much history." There was a brief silence, the kind that lands heavy between two people who understand exactly what that means. Victor exhaled sharply and said that was precisely why I would not be around much longer. I felt the words before I processed them, a physical reaction that started in my chest and moved outward. My hands curled into fists at my sides, not in anger, but in containment. They did not lower their voices. They did not check their surroundings. Thomas said it would be cleaner if operations leadership changed before the audit cycle. He said that would limit exposure. Victor agreed. He said it was unfortunate but necessary. He said stability was overrated if it got in the way of progress. I took one quiet step backward, then another, until their voices faded. I did not run. I did not rush. I walked to my office, closed the door, and sat down in the dark. For a long moment, I stared at my reflection in the glass. I thought about the toast. I thought about the way the room had laughed. I thought about how easily I had been reduced to a punchline, and how deliberately that had been done. Then my mind did what it had always done best. It started organizing. From 2020 through 2023, I had been the person who maintained the audit trail for our operational budgets. During the pandemic, exceptions became routine. Adjustments were framed as temporary responses, tax strategies, necessary flexibility in an uncertain market. I had documented everything, every revision, every approval, every email chain that justified why a number moved from one quarter to the next. At the time, it had felt responsible, careful. Now, sitting alone in my office, it felt like something else entirely. I packed up my laptop and left the building. At home, my daughter was already asleep. I stood in the doorway of her room longer than usual, listening to her steady breathing, thinking about the health insurance card in my wallet and the way stability had become a currency I could not afford to lose lightly. Sleep did not come easily that night. Over the next few days, I moved through work as if nothing had changed. Meetings, emails, deadlines. Victor acted normal, even warm. Thomas avoided my eyes. Then, late one afternoon, an email landed in my inbox from Hannah Liu in legal. The subject line was neutral, almost boring, a request for clarification. Her message was brief and careful. She said that if the board asked about the evolution of certain numbers, she would need me to explain the context. She asked not to delete anything. I read the message twice, then a third time. She did not accuse, she did not explain. She simply placed the responsibility where it belonged. That was when the pattern fully emerged. The toast had not been a joke, it had been positioning. The restructure was not about efficiency, it was about distance. And my removal was not personal, it was procedural. They were trying to separate the data from the person who understood it. Fear settled in then, real and sharp. Fear of losing my job, fear of losing the insurance that covered my daughter, fear of being labeled difficult after years of compliance. But fear, when given structure, turns into something else. That evening, after the office emptied, I stayed late. I pulled files from archived folders. I mapped timelines. I created a private index of emails, approvals, and revisions stretching from early 2020 through the end of 2024. I did not embellish, I did not speculate, I documented. As the hours passed, my fear gave way to focus. I saw how decisions connected, how responsibility flowed upward even when accountability did not. Power was not on the stage, it was not in the toast. It lived in the records, in the quiet systems that made performance possible. Near midnight, I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. Outside, the city lights blurred into something softer, less urgent. I was not planning revenge, I was planning survival. And for the first time since that night at the hotel, I understood exactly why Victor had laughed so easily. He thought the story ended where the spotlight faded. He did not realize the truth lived somewhere entirely else.
Chapter 4. Silence Documented. The shift came quietly, the way real consequences usually do. It started with a company-wide email in early January, sent just after most people had settled back into routine. The board announced an internal audit to be conducted by an independent firm, following concerns raised through legal review and the whistleblower hotline. The language was neutral, almost soothing, but the effect was immediate. The office felt different within hours. Conversations dropped in volume, doors closed more often. People checked their calendars twice before accepting meetings. Victor moved through it all with practiced calm. He greeted people warmly, joked about the inconvenience of audits, framed it as a standard governance exercise. Thomas, on the other hand, looked like a man holding his breath. His shoulders were tight, his responses clipped. He stopped lingering near my desk. Rachel, from Human Resources, became harder to reach. Her replies grew shorter, more formal. When we passed each other in the hall, she smiled without stopping. 2 days later, I received a meeting request marked confidential. It was from Elaine Porter. The invite included 2 names I did not recognize, representatives from the audit firm. There was no agenda attached. I arrived early, as I always did. The conference room was small, deliberately chosen. No glass walls, no distractions. Elaine sat at the head of the table, posture straight, expression unreadable. She nodded when I entered. She asked me to walk them through how certain operational numbers had evolved over the last 4 years. She said she was not looking for opinions, she wanted process. I took a breath and began. I explained how adjustments were approved during the pandemic, which requests came from finance, which came from executive leadership. I pointed out where documentation existed and where it did not. I noted which changes were brought to the board and which stayed within management. I did not accuse anyone. I did not speculate about intent. I spoke in timelines and references, dates and approvals, facts that did not need emotion to carry weight. One of the auditors asked if I had concerns at the time. I said my role was to document and execute approved decisions. Elaine watched closely, asking questions that cut through unnecessary detail. She wanted to know who had authority. She wanted to know who signed off. She wanted to know what happened when questions were raised. When the meeting ended, she thanked me and said they might need follow-up. Her tone was calm, but something in her eyes had shifted. Outside the room, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. At home that evening, my daughter met me at the door with a grin that barely fit on her face. She told me she had received an internship offer, a good one, paid, competitive, the kind that opened doors. Then her smile faltered. She said the offer was contingent on having confirmed health coverage for the next 6 months. Her school plan would not apply during the summer. She needed mine. The weight of it hit me hard. I had built my life around stability for her. The thought of losing that safety net tightened something in my chest. I told her we would figure it out. I meant it, even if I did not yet know how. The audit accelerated quickly after that. More meetings, more document requests. Victor began asking questions that felt rehearsed. He wanted summaries. He wanted assurances. He asked if I thought Thomas had been thorough. I told him I had always relied on the information provided. One afternoon, I walked into the break room to find Victor and Thomas standing too close together, voices low. When they noticed me, Thomas stepped back as if burned. Victor smiled and asked if everything was on track. I said the auditors were thorough. That was the first crack in his composure. Within a week, the findings began to surface. Adjustments that had never been presented to the board, decisions framed as temporary that became permanent, approvals that stopped one level short of where policy required. Victor started looking for explanations, then for scapegoats. He questioned Thomas openly in meetings. He asked why documentation was incomplete. He suggested finance had overstepped. Thomas defended himself stiffly, pointing to executive direction, to urgency, to trust. Neither of them looked at me. That was the irony of it. They were too focused on each other to see where the trail actually led. The data lived with me, the context lived with me, the understanding of how it all fit together lived quietly where it always had. As pressure mounted, Victor lost the polish that had once defined him. He snapped at assistants. He canceled meetings without explanation. His jokes stopped landing. One afternoon, Rachel asked if I had a moment. She closed the door behind us and said this was bigger than she had expected. Her voice shook slightly. I told her I understood. By the end of January, an email landed in my inbox marked urgent, mandatory board meeting, attendance required. I sat at my desk after reading it, my laptop open, the city gray beyond the windows. I thought about the years I had spent making myself smaller to keep things steady. I thought about my daughter counting on me. I closed my laptop gently, not with fear, but with a sense of alignment I had not felt in a long time. For the first time, I was not bracing myself. I was standing where I belonged, no longer invisible, no longer shrinking, ready to let the truth speak in rooms where it had always been meant to be heard.
Chapter 5. The Last Toast. The boardroom was colder than I expected, not in temperature but in mood. The windows looked out over a gray Chicago morning, and the long table held nothing but printed packets, legal pads, and a few untouched cups of coffee. No holiday centerpieces, no small talk. The kind of room where people did not perform, they accounted. Elaine Porter sat at the head of the table, shoulders square, hands folded as if she had been waiting for this moment for years. Victor took a seat a few chairs down, still wearing the same polished expression he carried into every room, the one that usually made people lean in and believe. Thomas Reed sat beside him, but he did not look at anyone. His gaze stayed fixed on a single spot on the table, like he could disappear into it if he stared long enough. I sat closer to the middle, where I could see everyone without being framed as a side character. 2 outside attorneys were present, along with a representative from the forensic firm that had conducted the independent review. Hannah Liu sat near the end, quiet, attentive, her pen already uncapped. Elaine began without easing into it. She said the board had reviewed the findings from the internal audit and the independent forensic analysis. She said the purpose of this meeting was to clarify accountability and determine next steps under the company's governance obligations. Victor nodded, too quickly, as if agreement alone could control the narrative. Elaine asked him to explain the decision-making process behind several financial adjustments between 2020 and 2023. She asked who authorized them, who documented them, and why the board had not been informed as required. Victor's leaned forward slightly, hands open, voice calm. He said it had been unprecedented time. He said management had to act quickly. He said the intent had always been to protect the firm and its employees. Elaine listened without reacting, then slid a page across the table, the kind of motion that ended arguments before they began. She said the independent review did not support that explanation. She said there were multiple instances where procedures were bypassed, approvals were incomplete, and representations were made that did not align with the records. Victor's smile tightened, but he kept speaking. He suggested the finance team had managed details without elevating them. He said he trusted his CFO. Elaine turned her head slightly toward Thomas. She asked if that was true. Thomas swallowed. His voice came out thin. He said he acted on direction. He said there were conversations and priorities set at the executive level. He said he documented what he could. Victor's head snapped toward him, fast enough that even the attorneys noticed. The calm veneer slipped for just a second. Victor said Thomas was mistaken. He said he never directed anyone to bypass governance. Elaine did not look impressed. She looked tired. She asked the forensic representative to summarize the key conclusion. The representative spoke plainly. Their analysis showed a pattern of adjustments that were not properly escalated, with email language indicating pressure to meet targets and avoid board scrutiny. They found recurring phrasing in communications that suggested awareness of policy and deliberate choice to work around it. Elaine thanked them, then turned to me. She asked me to confirm the origin of the operational records used to build the audit trail. She asked who maintained the documentation and whether the files had been altered. My mouth went dry, not from fear of speaking, but from the weight of finally being heard. I said the audit trail came from the operations archive, maintained under my department's protocols. I said the files reflected original timelines and approvals. I said I did not alter records, I preserved them. Elaine asked if any approvals were missing. I said yes. I said there were instances where approvals stopped short of required board acknowledgement. I said those gaps were visible in the record. Victor stared at me then, not with warmth, not with charm, but with the look of a man realizing a room had changed shape around him. He opened his mouth as if to reframe what I had said, to soften it, to turn it back into something smaller. Elaine raised her hand, gently but decisively, and he stopped. She asked me one more question. She asked if I had ever been instructed to reduce visibility of certain documentation. I paused. Hannah's eyes flicked to mine, steady, not pushing, just present. I said there were repeated reminders to keep reporting streamlined, and that certain items were described as too detailed for board review. I said those directions came from executive leadership. Victor's face flushed. He tried to laugh just once, the way he had at the holiday party, like he could turn discomfort into a joke and regain control. No one laughed with him. Elaine sat back, then looked down the table at each person in turn, as if she were measuring not just facts, but character. She said the board had a fiduciary duty to act. She said the evidence indicated governance failures and ethical violations at the executive level. She said they would not debate feelings, they would decide actions. She asked the outside counsel to outline options. The attorney spoke about administrative leave, termination for cause considerations, resignation requests, and further steps depending on regulatory exposure. The words were careful, corporate, legally tidy, but the meaning was blunt. Elaine called for a vote. The room went still in a way that felt physical. Papers did not rustle, coffee cups did not move. Even Victor stopped fidgeting. The vote passed. Elaine announced that Victor would be placed on administrative leave effective immediately, and that the board would require his resignation within the first quarter of 2025. The firm would appoint interim leadership and continue working with outside counsel to address compliance issues. Victor did not explode, he did not plead, he simply sat there, blinking, as if the world had made a decision without consulting the version of reality he preferred. Thomas exhaled shakily, relief mixed with dread. Rachel was not in the room, but I could already imagine how human resources would shift, how policies would suddenly matter, how people would claim they always valued respect. There was no cheering, no triumphant moment, just consequence. The meeting ended with procedural steps: keys to return, access to be limited, statements to be drafted. I gathered my notes, hands steady, and walked out of the boardroom without rushing. In the elevator, I saw my reflection in the mirrored wall. I looked the same hair, same tired eyes, same professional posture, but something was different. I was not bracing for impact anymore. Outside, the winter air bit at my cheeks. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the cold wake me up, letting the city noise remind me I was still here. Then I called my daughter. When Lydia answered, her voice was bright, then cautious, like she could hear something in my breathing. I told her it was done. I told her the board meeting was over. I told her I was still employed and our insurance would stay intact. I heard her inhale like she had been holding her breath for weeks without admitting it. She said she was proud of me. She said this is what speaking up looks like. I closed my eyes for a second and let myself feel it. Not victory, not revenge, but relief that I had finally stopped disappearing to keep other people comfortable. I drove home slowly, thinking about that night at the hotel, Victor lifting his glass and turning a room into a stage. He had wanted my silence to confirm his story. Instead, the records told the real one. If you have ever mistaken your silence for safety, I hope you remember this. Silence is only power when you choose it. When it is forced on you, it's just another way of being erased. And if this story stayed with you, if you have lived even a small piece of it, take a moment to share your thoughts and tell me what you would have done in my place. Your words might be the proof someone else needs to stop shrinking.